Maybe I'll preface by saying that we have one more podcast member coming. So if you see someone running in a minute, that's why. But I'm so excited to be joined by everyone here who worked on the podcast and did research for 8 weeks, like you heard at the beginning. And I hope you're all as thrilled as I am to hear what their findings are. So with me, I have Rishika, Deanndre, and Hushitha, and Aurélie, who will be coming soon. And there's also Gigi, who wasn't able to make it today. But we trust that everyone here will represent the findings just as well. So maybe before we start, who here knows what CCTV cameras are? Raise your hand. Okay, it's the majority of the room. We've all seen those little cameras in the corners that are stuck to the wall, or those kind of circular shapes on the tram. We know we're being watched, but do we know who's watching us and where that information goes? I, for one, don't have the answers. Many of you maybe also don't, or maybe you do. But those who worked on the podcast have some answers for us. So maybe the first question I will ask you three is, why did you pick the topic of private surveillance in public spaces? Why did you feel that this was a topic that needed further exploring?
I'll start. So I was mainly concerned from like a more broader perspective of the encroachment of private actors in public spaces. This might be just like social media platforms, but also the ways in which the state can like delegate certain operations or duties to private actors, and how there isn't this kind of direct accountability mechanism between citizens and then the private actors per se. Often that's mediated through the state itself, or there's just not as strong as a way for like civil society to engage with those private actors. And then narrowing it down into like, well, what's a very common private actor in public spaces? And that for me turned out to be CCTV cameras. So like CCTV cameras became more of like this operationalization of that broader question.
This is a very personal opinion. In general, especially in today's world, when you step out, you're being watched. It's continuously, you've been continuously monitored, your actions and everything. So it's just there wherever you go. So this was very interesting to me as to know and and also the process of trying to explore as to what is the where does the data go, how is it stored, and what is like being done with that, and how do people actually try to see you and everything. So this was like, in general, a very interesting concept for us to explore. So yeah, it's just there everywhere. Wherever you go, it won't leave you. So yeah.
Yeah, and one of the other points for us to decide on researching private surveillance through CCTV cameras in Geneva is because we came across a very interesting study early on in our research, which showcased a trend of private CCTV cameras exceeding the number of public cameras in public spaces. So this was a very interesting observation for us, and we decided to explore this further. And this is back in 2013, so we believe that this trend has largely continued.
You can keep it. Oh. Thank you. And it's also interesting, I hope everyone here listened to the podcast and did their homework, but if you haven't, we'll hear more from everyone. But it's also interesting that you picked International Geneva specifically to examine. And from the podcast, I know that you did interviews with people on the ground. I heard lots of wind in the background, but it sounded like you were able to speak to a lot of people that were in International Geneva. How did you go about picking the people you spoke to? Did you know them beforehand? Did you, flag them on the street? What was your method?
So it was a little bit of drawing on people that we did know and then snowballing from there. But then a lot of it, we just like kind of planted ourselves outside a UN organization or like along the road where a lot of the permanent missions are located. And whoever was walking past or like rushing to work, we would just like stop them and be like, oh, like we're from the Edgelands Institute. Do you have a few minutes for a few questions? And so some of them were very nice and they did stop to answer some questions. We did get a lot of responses from UNHCR as well as from the Graduate Institute of Geneva, and then near the permanent missions of Russia, Canada and I think South Korea. We got 1 or 2 responses from there, and then also Nations, the Square. And then some people also were just like, no, I'm busy, I'm late for a meeting, so they like scurried off. And we try to do that so that we could capture a bit of like international Geneva, like those people that we would assume would be in, you know, international Geneva. So I think that's what we did.
I'll put Aurélie on the spot here. We have our last member who's coming to join. Aurélie, just in time.
No pressure.
So maybe, Hushitha, can you tell us a little bit about the pros and cons of this method?
Yes, definitely. As Deanndre said, well, statistically speaking, it was a kind of random sampling. And as we were going by, I believe the pros would be that there's no bias, and it's almost representative. So, and cons would be, again, it's international Geneva, so I feel it cannot be representative again. So it's kind of a neutral word. So I think these were the main findings.
Aurélie, welcome.
Thank you. Apologies, everyone.
Maybe, do you want to tell us a little bit about what the findings were of the podcast? What did you discover?
I think, as Deanndre pointed out during the podcast, one of the more surprising, perhaps not so surprising issues was how participants realized there was an issue with the way in which CCTV cameras were managed, but could not quite point out where it was, whether it was the private sector, the way in which they held the CCTVs and trafficked the data, or whether there was an issue with the safeguards and the way in which the public had access to that information. And another surprising finding for me was how the boundary between private CCTVs and public CCTVs were actually not that clear-cut. So a lot of the private CCTVs were, as a matter of fact, used by the public sector in order to help with law enforcement. And this is not something that we actually had any access on into the safeguards and how that was managed.
Okay. Another interesting thing that we found during our experiment, the Q&A session, was that we asked people as to would you be comfortable being watched by the CCTV cameras, and almost everybody, I wouldn't say not all the interviewees, but then almost all of them had the same answer, which said, okay, I'm fine with it. But their answer had 2 perspectives to it. For some people, they were okay being watched, regardless of what they did. And for some people, they didn't care because they knew they were doing nothing wrong. And this was like really interesting. I mean, having different perspectives to the same answer. And this was interesting, even though when people knew that the private CCTV cameras outnumbered the government cameras.
It's a bit of that, and we heard this often in the diagnostic report when we were doing the interviews, was this, I have nothing to hide. So you can, take a look. But as you were mentioning, it's very problematic, and we have to question that.
Yeah, and just building on the point further about the prevalence of more private security cameras, when we questioned them about who they thought was behind the collection and monitoring of the footage from these cameras, most of them surprisingly pointed out to the public sector. And the police, the government entities, which was exactly the opposite of what the audience thought the answer would be. So this is like an interesting observation for us, because most people were convinced that it was only the public sector behind these private cameras. So yeah.
And I forgot to mention at the very beginning that if you have any questions, also please raise your hand. We can answer them now or at the end, but I'll pause here maybe for 10 seconds. See if yes, Wafe.
You mentioned some questions. Did you ask also the interviews if they knew what the data were used for, or it was only related to the stakeholders?
So you're asking like what we thought that the data or the recordings were being used for?
No, if you mentioned already the subject, like the fact that data are used for something or are not used. Like if you had some points about maybe people, they do not know what data are used for, if you ask them directly, and so on.
So I think that one of the things that did come out was that we all worked, even the people that we asked worked from the assumption that like CCTV cameras served the purpose of security. And you can see also a lot in the responses what Hushitha was saying as of like, oh, like they don't mind them watching, people don't mind being watched because it serves a security purpose. Like, oh, people can go back and find something that they may have lost, or it serves a greater purpose of protection of the community. But we did ask them a question of do they know who at least is regulating or looking at the footage? And a lot of people just said, no, they don't know. They then said maybe law enforcement or the police.
I think we also wanted to see, because the Geneva Internationale is composed of IOs, NGOs, and missions, how people, where their mind went when asked about CCTV. And quite funnily enough, is people from missions actually had more of a national security concern as opposed to a public safety concern about CCTV cameras. So the issue is, could it be a government, another government actually behind the private CCTV cameras? And this is not something that we saw in people who worked for the UN agencies, for example. So the way in which the data, people fear the data was used actually stemmed from completely different areas, and I think the open-endedness of the questions allowed for that narrative to emerge.
Thank you. I would be interested to know what is the regulation, if there is any, regarding those data and images collected. Is there a time frame that how long can they be kept by the public officers, but also by the privates? It's probably a difficult answer, a complex one, because of it will also where is the data stored. But would be interested about this regulating question. Thank you.
So when talking to some of the people from the security teams from some of the agencies, even though they were using private cameras, there was a very strict procedure to how the cameras could be reviewed. So the team that recorded, that was in charge of overseeing the footage, was not the same team that could then access the footage again. In terms of how the law enforcement agencies have access to the data and how long it can be kept is different, but I believe it's 3 months. Yes.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. You were exploring an area where there is a lot of different territory, right? So if I look, you just mentioned the Russian embassy. We can talk about the American embassy, right, or the UN. So it's interesting because we are in the city of Geneva, right, in the canton of Geneva, but at the same time in Russia and the US, right? If you look in a purely diplomatic space, and both of them, I'm taking Russia and US, but I can take other, right? But both of them have camera, if I'm that are not just exploring within their own territory, but also exploring outside, right? Any reflections about what it means? Who is in charge of that? How does that work? Did you access, for example, the Russian or the US CCTV? I'm intrigued. No, but just it's interesting in that moment, right?
So we have a very interesting story related to that. We were walking past the Russian embassy and like the permanent mission, and we stopped someone nearby who was walking along that street, and we asked him a question of, who we not want watching us? And then he said, enemies of the West. And we were like, could you elaborate on that? And then he said Russia and China, and we were like standing right by like the permanent mission. I think it's a little bit hard to, I think given the time frame that we had, we took a more like general approach, and as well as, consider feasibility issues. We were very lucky to speak to private securities at private security personnel at the conference center, actually. So that was also a great insight. But I think that I know that some of the regulations, if it's a private company, they do have like pretty strict regulations as well. But I think they do differ because we heard 3 months for the data collection. But when we spoke to someone that worked at the Geneva Center for he had, I think, previously worked in private security, and he said that it's 2 weeks that you're only allowed to like handle the data. So there is that disparity, and I think that, you know, not just disparity between private and public sectors, but like then the different territories that might be working in international Geneva. So this lack of harmonization also adds to like this vagueness around the ways in which CCTV cameras operate in Geneva.
I think an interesting point that was also raised from someone who worked at one of the missions, I won't name the mission, but the way in which they set up the CCTV cameras isn't necessarily to actually watch people, they're just performative in order to redirect any security concerns to other areas of the mission, which was actually quite interesting in the way in which the data is then used and what we don't actually know which data could possibly be used because some of them just don't work. Yeah.
It's really interesting. Some of them are there and actually record us, and others are kind of like
just there.
yeah.
I mean, the one from this the conference center, there was one of the cameras we were asking me, so what about this one? They're like, oh, we don't really know what this one does. But it's right in front of you. He's like, yeah, I'm not sure if it works. So definitely quite interesting how there is lack of cohesion even in keeping track of those CCTV cameras. There's so many of them, and there might be extra, but there is definitely a lack of communication even within the security teams.
Well, thank you to all of you and Gigi, who's not here, for the podcast and all of the research that you've done. Pedro, their mentor, was not able to be here. He's in Brazil, enjoying the warm weather, I think. But really, it's been such a pleasure, I think, to watch everyone do this research, and every week to hear from experts and to hear you all pose questions. I definitely have learned a lot. I feel like I've been a sponge in the corner, just hearing all of your questions and answers. And the podcast, if you haven't heard it, it sounds like a BBC World Radio podcast. It is excellent. It is so good. And would probably maybe give a bit more context about what we spoke about today. But we're all out of questions and time. But thank you, everyone, for listening and for coming. And thank you again to those who did all the research and made the podcast.